Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to start a series on the Trompowsky Attack, a very interesting opening choice for white, and I have to say I've had a lot of fun preparing the series. It's an incredibly complex and incredibly unique opening which avoids a ton of theory, so it doesn't require as much theoretical knowledge as the Queen's Gambit or the Catalan or many other opening systems. And the most important thing is it puts black on the back foot straight away, straight out of the opening. Now, today that may not be as true as 10, 20, 30 years ago when the opening first arrived, but back then it was a real confusing factor. Okay, to make navigating this video simpler, you can find chapters below, and if you're a patron of mine, you can find a study with all the notes and all the chapters and variations in your feed. Okay, so let us begin. We are looking at the Trompowsky attack, this position you can see on the board, where after white plays d4 and black plays the most popular move of all, on move 1 against d4, he plays knight f6. White does not continue c4, white does not continue in any standard classical fashion, he plays bishop g5. Now, the Trompowsky attack may seem a bit absurd when you see it first, playing bishop g5, firstly developing your bishop before your knights, doing nothing about your king safety because this does not develop the g1 knight or the f1 bishop or repairs to castle. But there's a very simple idea and a very effective idea behind this. White is preparing to create an imbalance in the position, which is going to make sure that the pawn structure is not symmetrical, that the material is not equal in a sense that both sides have the same number of minor pieces. So white is trying to trade bishop for knight, and it basically makes the position interesting. Most importantly, it's threatening to double black's f-pawns, and black has to do something about it if he doesn't wish to end up with double pawns. Now that's a pseudo threat, sort of. It's not a real threat to double the f-pawns, but later on, if that's allowed, if the f-pawns are doubled, the pawn structure is going to be extremely inflexible on the king side, and in the case of black castling king side, that could lead to issues. Now, black has several very good options. There are 6 main moves. In this introductory video, I'm going to briefly go over each, and then as I continue the series, I'm going to create a detailed video for each of the 6 moves you can see on the screen. So we are going to be looking at knight e4, e6, d5, c5, g6, and d6. Okay, so firstly, the Trompowsky was named after Octavio Figueira Trompowsky de Almeida, excuse my Portuguese pronunciation. He was a Brazilian chess player. He was born in Rio de Janeiro, played in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and this is basically what he is most famous for. He won the Brazilian championship once, so he wasn't really one of the top players in the world. But yeah, he gave the opening its name. And the Trompowsky, interestingly, has also been called the Zot. I have no idea what that means, or why it was called that, or who called it that, because I've never heard it until yesterday. Okay, there are 2 schools that have made the Trompowsky popular, and one of them just has to be mentioned, and that's the school of English grandmasters of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, namely Roy Hodgson, Michael Adams, Luke McShane, Tony Miles, and many others. And they've basically popularized the opening because they played it between themselves. And if you read books on the opening, on the Trompowsky, which, by the way, I would recommend 2. You always ask me about books on the openings I cover. The first one is Richard Pert, playing the Trompowsky. I found it most useful. And the second one is by Nigel Davis, the Trompowsky. And Richard Pert says in the introduction to his book that if you play the Trompowsky outside England, people are going to be confused. Now, the book wasn't written today, so that may not be true anymore, but that's fun. And the second school is the Armenian school, with Rafael Vaganyan being the main exponent of the Trompowsky. Okay, now let's get into the opening. So white has played bishop g5, and black has to do something about it. If black doesn't do anything about bishop g5, white is going to simply capture the knight, double the pawns, and after e takes f6 or g takes f6, white has a long-term structural advantage, which means that it's going to be easier to play in the center. Of course, when you don't have an e-pawn in the center, that means that white has two central pawns, and that's a big positional advantage. And if you capture with the g-pawn, then you're basically never, ever, ever castling kingside and finding safety for your king on g8. So if black allows white to capture the knight, then he's making a compromise either way. So we are going to divide black's responses into two groups. Group 1, preventing white from taking the knight. Group 2, allowing white to take the knight. And one thing you have to remember is that most of the time, if black allows you to take the knight, then you should take it and play the position as it's supposed to be played. You want to go for a structural edge. The two moves that prevent the knight from being captured, the first one is the main line, knight e4, gaining a tempo on the bishop. And the second one is pawn to e6, simply defending the knight with the queen. Now, knight e4, similar to bishop g5, breaks classical chess rules. You are moving the same piece twice, neglecting your development, but you are gaining a tempo on the bishop. So let us have a look at the move knight e4. Okay, firstly, I'm not going to go into great detail about the variations here. I'll just show you the main ideas, but in a separate video we are going to cover all of this. And one quick note, about 6 months ago, I was working on a new repertoire, and FIDE master Milan Jocev and I were studying the Trompowsky extensively, and I remember we spent 2 or 3 days on knight e4, and after that we decided we are not going to play knight e4 as black in response to the Trompowsky. It's very complicated. Okay, the three options are bishop f4, which is the only good move, basically the only objectively good move and the best move, or bishop h4 or h4. Now, let's start with h4 because that's very risky. h4 is called the raptor variation. And in this position, if black takes the bishop, then yeah, he is going to be in trouble because the h file opens. So against h4, black has to do something else, and he either plays c5 or d5, fights for the center, leaves this bishop there. But basically h4 is not a good move because it wastes even more time and allows black to fight for equality or more. The same could be said about bishop h4, which simply doesn't control enough of the board, and all variations end with g5, and this bishop is going to be harassed. Obviously, it has no good retreat squares apart from g3. So the main line goes c5, f3 chases the knight away, and g5 chases the bishop away. And now, after fe and gh and e3, you can see that this is a very imbalanced position, and this is extremely complicated. So since white wants to go for that, bishop h4 is justified. Is it good? No, it's not as good as the main lines. So the main move is bishop f4, and this is going to be the fighting ground in the Trompowsky in 90% of the games, I'm going to say, especially below super grandmaster level or grandmaster level, well, where people try to out-prepare themselves in sidelines. So after bishop f4, white is not threatening anything, so black is given time. Black has two options, d5, c5. c5 is much more aggressive than the main line. d5 sort of solidifies the knight, makes the position calmer. White can now choose between three things. He can chase the knight away or offer a trade, play e3, which is the most solid London system style, or he can play f3, which is probably the best move, and after the knight moves, play e4. These positions get extremely sharp, so takes and knight c3 is what should be played, basically playing for development, and after black captures a pawn, white now has a big lead in development, and it gets sharp. So this is white's way to try and complicate the position. After c5, white again plays f3, and now you can see how different the Trompowsky is to Queen's Gambit and the Catalan and basically all normal openings. Now, black is again given a choice. He could retreat the knight straight away, but I'll just briefly show you the main line because it is the main line. Queen a5 check forces c3 basically. If you play knight c3, black exchanges the knight. Now after the knight retreats, you can play d5, but you don't have to. d5 is just the best move, and queen b6 forces the bishop back. Black plays e6, challenging your pawn. You play e4, and this is just crazy. It's a theoretical position. It has been heavily analyzed. This is the most heavily analyzed position in the Trompowsky. But the point is, anything could happen. And it's really unclear who's going to win this position, but there's a really high chance that it's not going to end in a draw because it's not a normal chess position. So one thing I would like to highlight about the Trompowsky, that it most often creates positions which are very unfamiliar to most people. For each of these moves, I'll briefly show you the pawn structure that's most likely to occur in the middle game. So let's have a look at the pawn structure in positions after knight e4, and it's very important to look at potential middle game pawn structures when studying an opening. So in a while you can find the link to the full playlist in the description below. In about a week all the videos will be there, so if you're watching this a week from publishing, you can find all the videos there. But this is going to help you decide what to play with black against the Trompowsky, and it's going to give white a good idea of what to expect against each of these moves. Now with knight e4, of course, the f-pawns are not doubled, so black doesn't really have a structural disadvantage. You can notice a sort of similarity to the Benoni, with the exception of the c-pawn still being here, so black doesn't have a pawn majority. And this pawn is a sort of thorn in black's position, and it gains a ton of space. And if black is not careful, if that pawn is consolidated, that could be an edge. On the other hand, white is risking a lot. Of course, now in this imaginary position, the pieces are off the board, but this and this makes the king very weak. And the king isn't really going to be able to find shelter on either side of the board, which means that if black chooses to play knight e4, the main line, white has to accept that he will have to play for the initiative throughout, and he will basically risk being under pressure and risk having his king attacked until the late middle game or end game. Okay, the second most popular option is pawn to e6, and that again falls into the first group of doing something about the knight, and this is the simplest way, in my opinion, to play against the Trompowsky. The idea is to prevent bishop f6, because if bishop f6 now, queen f6, and black is great, has a lead in development, and what's the point? So the problem is e6 is passive, and it gives white the option to play very aggressively and to get basically what he wants. So there are three options here. Two passive options, knight d2 and e3, playing normal positions, and the main line e4. And this is going to be the main battleground after e6. Now something has to be done. Obviously white is threatening to win a piece, so black is going to play h6. In this position, bishop f6 is played, and after queen f6 you play knight c3. And the point is, white was given this immense center, and black's queen is misplaced. Obviously, the queen doesn't really want to be on f6. This is similar to the anti-Moscow, or Moscow, and the queen is eventually going to have to drop back. And also, black has to do something about these pawns advancing, so he cannot really develop easily. For example, bishop e7 would just be a dreadful move. Bishop e7. And what? This is just absurd. It doesn't work. Okay, so black plays something like d6, the queen goes to d2, and you can see what's happening. White is going to castle queenside, and the position is going to be very sharp, while black's king is still on e8. One of black's best options is to play g5, bishop g7, castles kingside, or castles queenside. Depending on what he wants to do. The other option is to play c6 and to go for an early e5, try to break open the position, sort of old Indian style. And for example, after g5 and castles queenside and bishop to g7, white can fianchetto his kingside bishop, let's say knight c6, and for example bishop b5. You can see that there is a ton of pressure on the black position. White is obviously going to play f4, and black has to hurry. So this is what I wanted to say when I told you that e6 gives white a great chance for initiative. So let's have a look at the resulting pawn structures. This is a very common pawn structure in e6 on move 2 lines. This is an example where black has castled queenside, which is arguably much safer because castling kingside seems suicidal after f4 and this pawn being traded off and then h4. And who has the advantage here? According to pawn structure, nobody should really have an edge here. White has a bit more space. And it's going to depend on piece activity and king safety. But usually black's king is going to be in trouble before they reach this point. If both sides know what they're doing, this is common. It's also very common for black to lose before this happens. Okay, now let's have a look at the remaining 4 moves which allow white to double the pawns. So coming to the second group of moves, let's start with d5. So d5, and there is a very important note I would like to say about this move. d5 is a psychological concession when played by most players. Why? If you play knight f6 on move 1 as black, you don't really want to play d4, d5 positions. So here, of course, we are going to get to that, bishop f6 is the Trompowsky move, but white can also play e3, white can play knight f3 going into the Trompowsky attack, white can play knight c3, white can play c4. So white can completely dismiss the idea of playing the normal Trompowsky, and this could be used just as a weapon to confuse black. So most knight f6 players are inexperienced with d4, d5 openings, so that may be a chance. That being said, bishop takes f6 is the justification of the Trompowsky. So now you take. Black has 2 options. As I said, if you take with the e-pawn, which is less popular, far less popular in this position, you're conceding the center, basically. You have a central pawn less, and it's going to be easy for white to play in the center. If you take with the g-pawn, your king never finds safety on the king side. So, for example, e takes f6, e3, c6, we have a Carlsbad pawn structure, but white still has the c4 pawn, which is important, so we play c4. And after d takes c4, bishop takes c4, something like bishop d6, and knight c3 and castles kingside. This position is always slightly better for white. It's not a major advantage. This, of course, is played on the highest levels. Don't get me wrong, white is not winning or anything. But this means that the pawn structure is not flexible. It also means that at some point f5 will have to be played. For example, knight d7 developing the knight, queen c2, because bishop d3 is coming, you play f5. And this cannot really be taken now because of tactical issues. We will get to that in the separate video. But for example, bishop d3 and g6. And how would you continue here? You continue h4, and black is already under pressure. So e takes f6, not so popular for a reason. Gf6 is much more popular. And now again, e3, black fights for the center with c5, but you just take it. And of course, this means that the black king will get in trouble if it goes to g8. So that's d5. And I read in the book I mentioned that this was the most common response from strong players, for example, Michael Adams, because it steers the game sort of into a position that's hard to lose. It's solid. This pawn structure is solid for black, and this is sort of like some lines in the Najdorf where the king stays on e7 and you have a compact pawn structure, but it's not as challenging. c5, which is the second move that allows bishop f6, is a very interesting option. I would say this is the most aggressive option for black. And after bishop takes f6, which is the main move, again the pawns are doubled. One thing I would like to mention is d5, which is interesting, claiming space in the center. But now this allows knight e4 and sort of transposes into knight e4, bishop f4 lines. And the queen, of course, uses the fact that the bishop has vacated the c1 square and undefended the b2 pawn, which is the reason why I'm not a big fan of d5. The other thing is after d5, black would play queen b6 straight away, and this basically forces a variation which is known as the Vaganyan gambit, or the poisoned pawn variation, where queen b6 and queen b2 is played. The bishop drops back to d2. White is supposed to have more than sufficient compensation, but it's tricky. So bishop f6 is the principled move. Now again, ef6 really not popular. Gf6 should be played, and now you play d5. And this is going to resemble Benoni positions very often because this pawn on d5 will create a barrier between the two sides of the black position. So for example, queen b6, queen c1, f5 prepares bishop g7, and now c4. And obviously after d6 is going to be a pawn structure very similar to the Benoni. So let's have a look at an example pawn structure. So this is something you can often get from c5 lines. This is a Benoni type structure because there is a bishop on g7, there is a pawn on d6, and this is quite similar to the old Benoni where the pawn is still on e7, so d6 is not a big weakness. Also, because of the doubled f pawns, it's very hard for white to play for e4, and also black does want to achieve his main break with a6, b5. The main asset for white is the unsafe black king wherever it goes. So these are the sharpest lines for a reason. They give black immense counterplay, as we are going to see in the video on c5, but it also gives white the pleasant feeling of knowing that the black king will never be safe. Okay, g6 is the most common uncommon move, if we can put it that way. This simply prepares an early fianchetto. It's sensible, but again it allows this, and it forces ef6. And against this is going to resemble the lines of the Caro-Kann, the Korchnoi variation, where white basically has a simpler position than black. And of course, as soon as g6 is played, you should keep your eyes open for h4, h5. So for example, bishop g7, g3 is the most common way to play castles, bishop g2, d6 opening up the bishop, and knight e2. And now it's possible to play knight c3, queen d2, castles queenside h4. It's also possible to simply go for a small positional edge with castles kingside. Let's have a look at the pawn structure. So white has two ideas. One is, okay, I'm going to get to an endgame and simply be better because it's not easy to dissolve this pawn, of course. And the second idea is, okay, let's checkmate black and play h4, h5. So again, I think black's options are fairly limited compared to white's. Okay, and finally the move d6, which I'd like to mention briefly, which is, I would say, the worst of black's options. After d6, the bishop prepares to be developed, of course, but bishop takes knight. And in this position, you take with the e-pawn. That's the principled way to play. And again, black goes for a very similar setup to g6, and in fact, these positions are going to transpose. So e3 and g6 and g3, and we've seen this before, bishop g7, bishop to g2, and f5, for example, opening the bishop up. Again, more pleasant for white. The bishop on g2 is great. The b1 knight has the option to wait for c4 or to go to d2. The g1 knight can go to e2, which is far more common. It could also go to h3 and look at g5 and f4. It could also go to f3. So interesting positions. The resulting pawn structures, which happen most often, give white a lot of central space and a lot of central control. He will have issues with the e4 square, but note that the f6 knight has been traded off. So black would have to do something like this with his b8 knight to occupy this square. Worst case scenario, white could snap that off, or the c3 knight could trade itself. That being said, a pawn on e4 could be a problem, so you have to be careful doing that. So it's not that black doesn't have play, but again, it's easier for white to play after d6, and d6 by far the most passive option. So coming back to the knight e4 lines, this is going to be the main battleground and the most detailed and longest separate video. All 6 are going to be covered, and I hope after the series is over, you will have a weapon for white. I mean, as I said, I spent a lot of time preparing with black. I'm not going to say what I play against the Trompowsky, because I'm not really sure myself. I basically play 3 moves. But as I make the videos, I'll give you my recommendations. And hopefully after this you'll be prepared for both sides, which was my goal when I was preparing the series, and I'm much more comfortable playing this with both colors now. Okay, thank you for watching. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions, please leave them below. I'd be happy to answer them. Again, link to the full playlist is in the description. Navigate with the chapters, and the full PGN for this video is on the Patreon feed. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.